Buenos días a todas y todos los que hoy nos acompañan en esta reunión. Estamos todavía entrando, pero bueno, son las 9:05 y nos gusta tener también respeto por todos los que se pudieron loguear a las 9, y sabemos además que hay mucha gente que se tiene que ir en punto, así que hoy tenemos una sesión súper interesante, así que queremos reservar la mayor cantidad de tiempo posible para nuestro speaker. Hoy vamos a tener una sesión diferente de la Comisión de Behavioral Compliance, porque en realidad vamos a tener una sesión en inglés, o mixta en realidad. Vamos a hablar un poco y un poco. Cristian entiende algo de español, de todas maneras su lengua fluida, digamos, es el inglés, y nos pidió hablar en inglés, y las preguntas que ustedes hagan en el chat, si las pueden hacer en inglés, mucho mejor. Si no pueden, intentaremos traducirlas para pasárselas a Cristian, y él las va a responder en inglés, y como ustedes saben, va a haber un video donde se graba todo esto, y lo vamos a tener después subido en el canal de YouTube de la asociación. También vamos a preparar con Diego y con Susana un mini paper condensando los contenidos de lo que hoy se habló, para los que tienen por ahí más dificultad con el inglés. Así que esto es así como un mini resumen. Quiero agradecer a todos por unirse, especialmente quiero agradecer a la Asociación de Ética y Compliance por darnos este espacio para esta comisión de estudio, en particular el apoyo de Laura Labia, que es la directora de las comisiones de la asociación, y de Ramiro Cabrero, que es el presidente de la asociación, y de tantos otros dentro del grupo del comité ejecutivo de la Asociación de Ética y Compliance, que realmente nos dieron nuestro apoyo para poder estar hoy aquí. Behavioral es un tema fascinante, tiene muchísimos aspectos y aplicaciones. Las ciencias del comportamiento, que en realidad es como nosotros lo llamamos en castellano, vienen descubriendo cada vez más cómo funciona nuestro cerebro, cómo tomamos decisiones, y están tratando de entender cada vez más y acercarnos a quienes somos realmente, y no los modelos ideales con los que tradicionalmente siempre hemos trabajado. Y por eso la aplicación en compliance es algo relativamente novedoso, pero entendemos que es algo muy rico, por eso armamos esta comisión para estudiarlo. Y hoy tenemos un panelista de lujo, de esas cosas que la pandemia también nos regala, porque esta posibilidad de trabajar virtualmente nos permite tener hoy a Christian Hunt con nosotros. Antes de presentarlo, solo un parroquial más, para decirles que por favor, el chat está abierto para saludarse y decir cosas, pero les vamos a pedir que las preguntas, por favor, las hagan en el Q&A o en la sesión de preguntas y respuestas, porque ahí va a ser más fácil para nosotros encontrarlos. En el chat empiezan a volar los mensajes y realmente va a ser difícil para nosotros recuperar las preguntas. Así que, por favor, preguntas en el Q&A. La sesión de hoy, Cristian va a hablar, va a hacernos una presentación, y después le vamos a hacer algunas preguntas. Así que tienen tiempo para ir pensándolas, las vamos a ir contestando más sobre el final de la sesión del día. Christian, hi, good morning, good afternoon for you. Christian is based in London. And I would like to introduce you. I was telling everybody how we thank you for joining us today. Christian is many, many things. I will read a shorter version of what he is, but it's not just, and you will see and you will discover him. Christian is the founder of Human Risk. Human Risk is a behavioral science-led consulting and training firm. He's specializing in the fields of ethics and compliance. He was formerly MD at the UBS Bank, where he was the head of behavioral science. Christian joined the firm in compliance and operational risk control, leading the function globally for UBS Asset Management. Prior to joining UBS, he was the COO of the UK Prudential Regulation Authority, a subsidiary of the Bank of England, responsible for regulating financial services. But he's much more than that, and we will see it today. Thank you, Christian. This is all yours.
Thank you so much, Mariana, and it's an absolute pleasure to be here with you virtually, even though I can't be with you in person. And please be aware that as soon as we are able to travel, Argentina will be very high on the list of places that I want to go back to. So thank you for sharing your morning with me. I'm going to talk a little bit about some of my thoughts. And what I want to do is to really put some ideas into your minds, to pose some questions, and to get you to think potentially slightly differently about what compliance means and what it is there to do and how we do it. So the presentation today isn't going to be a lecture in the traditional sense. It's going to be slightly unusual because I'm controlling it using this PlayStation controller. That's right, we are not just talking about behavioral science, we are going to use some behavioral science in the presentation. And the benefit of the PlayStation controller is that I can do things like this, and I can make myself smaller and move around the screen. So as I'm talking, the slides will appear behind me. Some of them obviously will have lots of English words. So please, if there are things that are not clear, that don't translate well, just ask in the questions and we can cover that. I'm going to talk for about 30 minutes. And during those 30 minutes, I'm going to talk a little bit about me. I love talking about myself, my journey, and some of the things that I've discovered. And what I want to do is just to promote different ways of thinking about how we meet this challenge of compliance. And I'm going to start by talking to you about what I'm here to talk about, which is bringing behavioral science to compliance. And that rhymes in English, and we like things that rhyme, and things that rhyme must be good. And what you'll see here is also my company name, Human Risk. And one of the questions that people often ask is, okay, you talk a lot about compliance, but what is human risk? And the answer is that compliance is part of human risk. And my definition of human risk are the words on the screen now. I define it as the risk of people doing things they shouldn't or not doing things they should. And notice in that definition, I'm talking about things which covers every potential aspect of behavior that we want to influence. And I talk about doing and not doing. And very often when we think about the challenges of getting things right in organizations, we tend to think about people making mistakes, taking risks, breaking rules. But actually, inaction can be just as dangerous. So if we don't do something that's important, that can cause us problems. And I see compliance as sitting inside this broader category of human risk, because there are lots of things in the organization that we want people to do or not do. And as we think about that, we're involved in the same activity, whether we're talking to people about a law, whether we're talking about a compliance requirement, or whether we're talking about just a matter of HR policy. It's all the same thing. We are trying to influence people. And this occurred to me as I started my career in London. So this is the city of London. And I have highlighted the various places that I have worked within the city. One, because I like showing people pictures of places they can't travel to, but two, because I want to illustrate an interesting point about my career that has brought me to the realization of the importance of thinking about behavior. And you'll see across the bottom here that I started my career in banking. I was at Deutsche Bank in investment banking. I then accidentally moved into regulation, and I joined here the Bank of England, which is just here, which is the central regulator for financial services. And then from there, I went to UBS, which was here, in a compliance role. And so I am talking to you as someone that has worked in a business, in banking. I then became a regulator, and I have then moved into compliance. And as I did all of those three things, I started to recognize the importance of people as a cause of risk and as a challenge. And the biggest example of that was this gentleman here. He is called Kweku Adeboli. And in 2011, he was responsible for a rogue trading incident at UBS, the Swiss bank. And I had become a regulator 7 days before. That's what the 7 up here is for. 7 days before we discovered what he had been doing. And he had been trading outside his mandate and putting the firm in a quite dangerous position that if he had continued could have closed the bank down. And I spent most of my career as a regulator managing the results of his work, managing that particular situation, but also stop it from happening again. And I moved from the regulator to UBS because I had spent most of my time at the regulator looking at UBS. And what happened when I was at UBS was I was responsible for implementing lots of the rules that I had created as a regulator. So I was in the very unusual position of having to eat my own regulatory cooking. I had written the rules and now I was having to implement them. And what I started to realize as I was implementing the rules that I had put on the firm was that actually we had an interesting challenge in compliance. And I was working in compliance and operational risk. And operational risk, for people not in financial services, is all of the risks that aren't related to finance. So cybersecurity, fraud, any kind of thing that's not directly related to lending money or stock markets or interest rates. Those are the risks that I was responsible for alongside compliance responsibilities. And what I realized was that we weren't landing with people. People didn't like compliance. It wasn't something they appreciated. They thought it was annoying, and it didn't really get them to behave in the way we wanted. And this became a really interesting challenge because I was responsible for making sure the organization was compliant. So I was interested in how we could improve that. And what I realized that when we think about compliance, compliance is the business of influencing human decision-making. Now that sounds strange, but the reason I say that is organizations can't be compliant of their own accord. You can't say to a company, be compliant, and expect to get the right outcome. What happens actually is it is the people within the organization that determine whether or not you are compliant. So if you would like your organization to be compliant, what you need is all of the people within the organization to do the things that you need them to do and to not do the things that you don't. And once you realize that every aspect of compliance is all about getting people to behave in a particular way, to do something, and even where it's a computer system doing the work, to program it correctly, to understand the information that's coming out, you start to see the challenge slightly differently. And I no longer think of compliance as being about rules, but I think it's about influencing people and getting those people to behave in the right way. We train people. We write policies for people, not for machines. And the challenge I think we have with compliance is that the brand is not very good. If I have a look in an English dictionary, this is where the word compliance appears. And it sits between two words that are not nice. It sits between complex and complicated. And this is how I think people see compliance. It's a negative brand. It's an obstacle. And if we want to be successful, we need people to start thinking about us slightly differently. And the reason we need people to think about us slightly differently is that far from being a function that is specializing in rules, what we're actually doing is running a laboratory. We are conducting experiments on people. We're doing it in their brains, not with medicine, but we're conducting experiments to try and get them to behave in the right way. So all of the rules that we write, the policies, the training that we give, the construct, all of the things we do are all around getting people to behave in a particular way. And so what we're doing is running a laboratory that is experimenting on those people. And we don't often think about it in those terms. But if you look at what we're trying to do, we should be asking ourselves, well, what object are we trying to achieve? What is compliance here to do? And the answer, of course, is to make sure that people are compliant, that they are following the rules. But here's the problem. Because when you start to think about what compliance is about, not all of the rules are the same. And so here are three simple examples of things where the outcome that we're looking from a behavioral perspective is very different. So if we start over on this side, the image is of a hacker. So this is about cybersecurity. And cybersecurity is a good example of something that fits into a category you might call it only takes one to harm. if one person does this bad thing, we have a problem. So we need to try and prevent that from happening. That is different to the sort of thing you see here, where I've used recycling as an example, but you can think about others where it's not something that we can make mandatory, but it's something that we need as many people as possible to do. The more, the merrier. The more people that do this, the better. But we can't force it on people. It's a soft requirement. Maybe we can't see what's happening. Maybe it's something where we need people's engagement. That is a different challenge. And then over here, we've got whistleblowing as an example of it only takes one to help. I want people to whistleblow for the right reasons, at the right time, if it's appropriate. I don't want everybody whistleblowing, and I don't want to incentivize people to whistleblow. I want it to just happen at the right times. And those three outcomes, they're all instructions, they're all requirements. But they're also very different if you think about the psychology of what I'm expecting from people. One of them is a don't ever do this. One of them is a please do this all the time if you can. And one is do this when you're doing it for the right reasons, but not all of the time, and think about what you're doing. And so when we think about that challenge, we can't just use the same techniques all of the time. We need to think a little bit more carefully about the people that we're trying to influence. And one of the things that is interesting when you look at compliance is I think of employees as a target audience. These are the people that we are trying to influence. So in the same way that advertisers are trying to influence customers and potential customers, we have our own target audience of employees. But we need to think about who we are targeting and why. And if you ask people what compliance is there to do, this is an illustration of the thinking. We have two kinds of people in the organization. We have bad people doing bad things, and they're really big because they form a key part of our thinking. We think about them a lot, so they're big. And then we have good people doing good things. And we tend to think of the world in these very simple terms. We are trying to stop bad people from doing bad things. And that's the story that we tell ourselves, because that's the story that we have grown up with as children. When we look at movies, when we look at stories, it's always about good and evil. And so when we tend to think about compliance, it's about stopping those bad outcomes. We're trying to stop those bad people. But if you think about what bad people are, they're not all the same. And in a compliance context, we can have different kinds of them. We can have bad actors. These are people that are deliberately setting out to commit fraud. We can have situational wrongdoers, people that are well behaved normally, but if you find them in a particular situation, they might have a tendency to do. So if they walk past a building and a door is open, they might go in, but if the door is locked, they won't. The situation will drive their behavior. Or we might have individuals with blind spots, people who are normally ethical and moral and compliant, who might miss the situation and might misread a situation because they are blind to some particular issue. There may be a senior person who is very correct most of the time, but doesn't understand conflicts of interest. And so even if we focus on the bad people, we have this challenge of there are lots of different reasons why people might do bad things. And I think a more helpful model for what we should be focusing on is this. And what you'll notice is that the bad people and the good people are very, very small on this slide. And the reason for that is that I don't think we should focus too much on them. We need to stop the bad people. But if we focus our whole program on the bad people, we miss a really good opportunity. And that opportunity is to deal with the people that are here. These are the average employees. The majority of your employees do not sit either here in the good category. There are some people who will always do the right thing. Very moral, always very well-behaved people. There are a few people like that. There are also the bad people here, that we have them here, and we need to find ways to stop them. But they, if you take them on a training course, if you read them rules, they don't care. They're not interested. And the good people we don't need to deal with. What we need to focus on is the people in the middle, the average person, the vast majority of people. And yet what we tend to do in compliance is focus on the bad people. We send people on training because we think they might do something wrong. We have a policy that focuses on communicating all the things we don't want them to do and the things we want them to do. And the danger, if you send a message to people that you think they might do something wrong, is that you run the risk of driving them over here. Because if we treat people like we think they are criminals, like we think they are bad people, then they will respond accordingly. And so what I think we need to be doing is saying, yes, we need to eliminate the bad things. We need to catch the criminals, the really bad people. But for the average person, what we need to think about is how can we make sure that the average people move in this direction and not in this direction? And that's the challenge that we face in compliance, is that most people come to the office and want to do the right thing. And what we need to do is find structures that support them to allow that to happen. And if we don't start to think about things from their perspective, the risk that we run is that we treat them as if they belong in this corner. And if you say to someone, I think you are a criminal, and you send that signal, then very quickly you run the risk of them behaving like that. So when I look at how we do compliance, I think it's important to recognize the techniques that we can use and how we can think about it. And so I think it's helpful to think about compliance as a toolkit. And the things I'm about to say to you are not things that are revolutionary or particularly clever, but we often don't think about the techniques that we use and why we're using them. We just tend to deploy techniques that we've always used or that we feel comfortable with. And those techniques can sometimes be very valid, but sometimes they can lead to bad outcomes. So what I want to take you through now is what I call the compliance toolkit, techniques that we often use without thinking about it. And if we start to think about the techniques that we use, maybe we can identify when those are good and when those are not so good. And I love the idea of tracking the compliance toolkit as in the same way that we grow up. So the first thing in the compliance toolkit is what I call orders. We just tell people what to do. There is no negotiation. They just do it. This is what we do with very small children. Children don't know anything. We just tell them, and they must follow instructions. So this is orders. Now, this is very valid in some situations. In a nuclear power station, in food safety, I don't want people getting creative. So this can be very appropriate. But we can also overuse this in situations where it might not be the best course of action. And as we get older, we move away from orders to rules and regulations. And this is where children start to understand the world. And we can say to them, okay, you understand enough. I'm going to set some rules and parameters and you can behave within those. And again, as adults, that can be very valuable. It can work very well if the situation that people are in is easily understood and it lends itself to being codified. Makes a lot of sense. Then the next thing that we try to use as kids get older is economics. We use penalties and rewards, bribery and punishment. And we say, if you tidy your bedroom, you will receive a reward. And if you don't do something, you will be punished. And of course, that is also something that we use sometimes within organizations, and it can be very powerful. But the problem with that is that if you start paying somebody for something, and you will know this if you have kids, you will have to keep paying them because the relationship that you've created is based around those dynamics. Equally, if you start punishing people for not doing something, you have to keep punishing them. So it becomes a little bit of a cyclical dynamic here, but it can work very effectively. And then the final technique that we often use in compliance is what I call educate and inform. And this is a little bit like the thing that governments do with medical campaigns. I want people not to smoke, so I'm going to tell them why it's bad for them. I'm going to point out the reasons why smoking is bad. And I will assume, because you are an adult, that you will understand this and you will react accordingly. And that can work. But equally, people sometimes aren't sensible. People don't always do things that are healthy for them, even when they know they're not healthy. So in a compliance context, we have to think very carefully, if we're using this technique, is this something the audience is genuinely going to react to in the right way? Or am I making assumptions about the way they look at things? And all of these techniques can work and can be very powerful. but we often just deploy them without thinking about them and the impact that they're having. And what I want to do by highlighting this is to say, think about which of these tools you're using, and you can, of course, use them in combination before you go ahead and use it. Because if you have misjudged the target audience, if you are making assumptions about their reaction, then it's going to be less effective. And in fact, it might even be counterproductive. You might get totally the wrong outcome. And that's why I'm a massive fan of another bit of toolkit, which is to use behavioral design. And what behavioral design says is, let's think about how we can influence people by recognizing how they feel about the situation, how they're approaching the situation. And then we design an environment that is effective at managing that environment. And so you can use all of the techniques in the toolkit, but there are lots more techniques that we can use if we start to think in these terms. And examples of those techniques are on the page here. Now, these are just a few examples of the kinds of things that we can start thinking about. And some of these you will be using, but some of them you might not have thought about. And very often we don't think about these as compliance tools. So if we start over here, the first category I have highlighted is gamification. We all love playing games, and whether that's traditional board games like here, or whether that's video games like here, playing games is a good way to engage people. And so if we can turn compliance into more feeling like a game, and I don't just mean quiz shows or competitions, I mean using things like the tricks that they use on our Apple Watches, all of these devices that cleverly nudge us to do things, we can use in a compliance context. And so if we can make things engaging and fun, then we have a greater likelihood that people will pay attention. The other thing we can start to do is to make compliance a bit more personal. We know from behavioral science that if we make something personalized, if we address someone in person, if we write their name on the coffee, they are more engaged towards it. It feels more. So we can start to use that as part of the way that we engage our audience. And then we know all about social media and how dangerous it is. But we also know that social media works very powerfully. So the techniques that they are using in a social media context to get us to log on, to get us to communicate and get us to engage can also be used in compliance. And what I'm trying to say to you here is that the influences on how we deliver compliance shouldn't just be the influences of how we grew up, how our parents treated us as we were growing up and our teachers treated, but we have a load of other things that we know about that we can start to deploy. And we can think about things going viral. That's up here. Viral, whether we're talking about COVID or whether we're talking about news, information, stories, videos, all of these things, they work for and they influence human beings. And if we can think about that internally, we can use some of these things because the human brain doesn't differentiate between compliance and having fun. It doesn't think of those things separately. It's all information. So things that work in other contexts can also work in a compliance context. And my favorite thing to point out to people is this here. This is curiosity. One of the things that we often don't think about is how we make people curious about compliance. Now, it sounds weird, but if you're interested in a subject, you will pay much more attention than if you're not. And one of the ways that newspapers and that websites get us to read their stories is they create headlines. They ask us questions, they get our interest. And very often we think of compliance as we will deliver this. We will just tell them what to do. But if we could find a way to get people asking questions, to get their interest, you will get much more engagement from them. And the important thing to recognize is that this is really easy to do. And once you've done it, you don't have to spend a lot of money. It's just about an approach and a way of thinking. And so you can't do this all the time. But a lot of the techniques that I'm talking about lend themselves to different situations. And when I talk about behavioral science, I've just talked about how we design things, but we can also use it as a diagnostic tool. We can also think about when things aren't working the way we want them to. Very often what we do is we blame people. We say lots of people are not complying with this rule. We need to punish those people. And the logic that we use for that is the same logic that we use for speed cameras here. Speed cameras make a presumption that the problem is people. And in that case, it is, because humans are driving cars. So what we do is we try and catch people. But there's an interesting lesson from the world of motoring, where actually one of the things that we also think about is not just who are the bad drivers, but we also think about which roads are dangerous. And if we have lots of accidents on a particular bit of road, we don't just look at the drivers. We also look at the road and we say, what's going on this piece of road? We need to do something about the environment. We need to change the way the road is structured, more signs, slow people down. And this logic, where we say we need to think not just about people, but actually the environment that is driving those behaviors, is something that we often miss in compliance. So I like to say, if 1 or 2 people break a rule, then you probably have a people problem. But if lots of people break a rule, then there's a problem with the rule. In other words, we go back to the model of what are my population? 1 or 2 people doing something they shouldn't do is probably them being bad people or making a mistake. But if lots of people are doing it, there is something wrong. The rule is badly phrased. The training wasn't good. The training was at the wrong time. Lots and lots of people doing something means there is some problem with what you're asking to do. They can't all be dumb, bad, evil, whatever you want to call it. There must be something in the environment. So what behavioral science also allows us to do is not just design things, but think about actually how we can factor in what's going on. We can work out, why is this rule being broken? Because we start to analyze it from a behavioral perspective. So if we think about the challenge as behavioral, as opposed to here are some rules, they must do that, we can recognize ways that we can use different techniques to get the message across. And so the feedback that we have from people's behavior is very powerful if we want to design things that are more effective. And I'm going to finish by talking about a few examples of compliance in the wild. And I say this because one of the things that we often do is when we look for inspiration for how to do compliance better, we often look at compliance. We look at what other people do in the same context. We look at what we do in the same context. But there is a world out there where there are lots of examples of things that we can see that are good and bad, where we could use that to design our compliance program. And so I spend a lot of my time looking in the real world and saying what works well and what doesn't, and what can we learn from that for what we do inside organizations. And a good example here would be under COVID. COVID is a compliance experiment that we have been conducting. We've all been involved with it. Everybody now understands compliance. Unfortunately, everybody probably hates compliance more than they did before, but there are lots of examples. So when you see what the government is doing, pay attention to whether you think it's good or bad. And if it's good, maybe we can copy that technique. Here is the UK government doing a really bad job. We want people to practice social distancing, so we will put up a sign. What are people doing? Nothing. They are ignoring the sign. It's a good example of a terrible way to influence compliance. I will tell you, I will assume you'll do it, but clearly you won't. And we see lots of other examples of things in the real world that have a resonance for compliance. If I download some software or I rent a car, I'm required to click or to sign my name to be able to use the software or to rent the car. So a good example here, this is what Apple asked me to do or tell me to do, in fact, force me to do before I can download the software. And we know what happens technically when I do that. I am reading this and I'm agreeing to the terms and conditions. But we know in reality that nobody reads this stuff. I haven't got any choice. I can't negotiate. If I want to use the software, I have to click. If I want to rent the car, I have to sign. And so we are used to doing that. And so when you see people in a compliance context using things like attestations, click here to say that you have read all these policies. Legally, you are signing up to something, and that has legal effect. But if it's genuinely about getting people to read this and pay attention, we know from the real world it's not effective. And so one of the things that we can do is we look in the wild at what is going on is we can recognize when there are dynamics that drive a certain behavior in us, because there will be no difference between this and what people do in an employment situation. And in fact, in an employment situation, the risk is even higher. And the reason the risk is higher is if I don't sign here or click here, I will lose my job. And if that's the pressure that I'm under, I'm very likely just to sign. I'm not going to pay too much attention to what I'm being told. So if the object is just to provide legal protection, then that's fine. But if the object is genuinely to know whether people have read all the rules, understood all the rules, then this is a terrible way to do it. And we can learn that from looking in the real world. And here's another example of compliance in the wild. This is from London, here where I am now. And they had a problem in the finance district with people dropping cigarettes. And so what they thought they would do was a very logical approach of, we will tell you this is bad. And so they put signs up telling people how much it costs to remove the cigarettes, that's here. And they put up these things that showed you how many cigarette butts there were. And it's a very logical approach. If we share the problem, people will understand it and they will do the right thing. But the problem with this is it thinks logically, it doesn't think psychologically. And the psychological response to this is, if I'm a smoker, that I see the big numbers, I see the lots of cigarette butts, and I conclude that lots of people must be smoking. It's not me on my own, it's everybody. 3.8 million pounds it costs. That's a hell of a lot of cigarettes. So the conclusion I reach is that actually this is a massive thing. Lots and lots of people are doing it. And therefore the message to me is keep doing it. It's okay. Lots of people are doing it. So here is a campaign that is designed to get people to stop doing something that actually has the opposite effect. It actually encouraged the one thing it was trying to prevent. So here's a good example of how you might do it more effectively. This was an attempt to get people to stop smoking outside the underground stations in London. They didn't like, you can't smoke in the network, so they wanted people outside. And people were standing in the doorway dropping cigarette butts. What did they do? They turned it into a game. And you could vote here on your favorite footballer. Apologies to you, my Argentinian friends, that your representative is scoring slightly less. But this game worked really effectively. People could see that other people were putting their cigarette butts in. And what it also did was it got people to move location. So they put this opposite the station, people moved away and they smoked somewhere else. So with one thing, they changed two dynamics. Firstly, they moved where people smoked. And the second thing is they got people to not drop their cigarette butts on the floor. It's not a compliance situation. But we can use the same logic. Putting up signs saying, please don't smoke here, doesn't work. Putting up signs telling people why it's a big problem doesn't work. Sending emails to people telling them not to break rules doesn't always work. So we need to think about alternative ways. And this is a good example of thinking creatively about how you solve it. What we need to do when we're managing compliance, and this is from near me in London, is to not do what they've done here. Because what they've done here is to try to stop people taking bicycles down the path. So straight over here. You want to stop people taking bicycles down the path. So you put these barriers. But you can see what's happened. People have found a way round. This is designing for what we would like people to do. The theory of how we'd like them to behave, but not the reality of how they're likely to behave. And not only is this a waste of money, but you can see that because that path that's there above my head here is so well used, nobody is going to respect these rules anymore. We have very clear evidence that no one is respecting the rules. It's a really good example of a perfectly designed compliance program that is highly likely to fail. And I'm going to finish with an example of an amazing compliance intervention in the wild that I think will hopefully inspire you. And this comes from America. And this is from a school. And what they had to do was make their classrooms COVID secure to ensure that the kids could come back. And the teacher was forced to put up these glass screens. And what they realized was that that would be horrible, because even as adults, having screens around you is not fun. So what did the teacher do? She turned the desks into vehicles. Everybody is suddenly in their car. And it's, you know, it's their car because if you look down here, you'll see there are personalized license plates for every kid. This is a really good example of how you embed compliance into a business process so the kids have a good time, they're learning, they don't even realize that they're being compliant. And the reason this works so effectively is that the teacher has thought about things from a behavioral perspective. She's thought about how the kids will feel, how they will react, and she has designed an environment that makes it simple for them to do what she wants. She wants them to sit there and pay attention. How do I do that? How do I get their engagement? I make it engaging and make it human for them. And very often, compliance that we see in organizations doesn't think in these terms. What it does is it interferes, it stops, it blocks. And sometimes we have to do that. But very often, if we think behaviorally, we can get the people that we're trying to influence to behave in a way that we want, because we've created an environment where that feels like the right thing to do, where it's much more straightforward. And so if we think about compliance as a behavioral challenge, suddenly we can start to do things that are totally different and much more effective and not very expensive. So with that said, I'm going to show you two little behavioral science tricks on this page. The first trick is right here. If you have enjoyed this and you are interested in this subject, I have a newsletter that comes out that talks about this in a little bit more detail, talks about stories in the news, looks at research, looks at other things that you might find interesting. If you want to subscribe to that, if you get your camera phone and take a picture of the QR code, it will take you to the sign up page. Very simple behavioral science trick. I would like you to do that, so I'm making it easy for you. You'll see down here, if you want to connect with me on LinkedIn, just search for Human Risk and feel free to connect. And then the most important thing is up here. It's the question that I'm asking. I've said, what questions do you have? This is also behavioral science, because I'm not saying, do you have any questions? If I said that, there's the potential for you not to have any. Instead, I've said, what questions do you have? That means I'm expecting questions and I would like to hear them. Thank you.
Thank you, Christian. That was a very interesting presentation. And we have, in fact, many questions. I will pass on to Susana, because she has the first one.
Well, thank you very much. It was really very interesting to hear and to see the way you present all the questions, the problems, the examples. It's very, very interesting. The first, wait a second. The first question I have is, your approach to compliance is different from the way in which many organizations have traditionally approached. Is this something that regulators welcome, or do we have to convince them of the benefits? What do you think about it?
So this is a great question. Thank you. Obviously, when we are being when we have a compliance function, we are trying to comply with rules, and there are regulators there that make sure that's happening. So in many cases, we are not just trying to make sure that we do what the rules say, but we're also trying to make sure that we keep those people happy. And so this is a really important thing to go and talk to regulators about, because if you just do this and they don't understand, some of them will see this negatively. But there's an interesting parallel, because I have the same conversation with regulators about how they write rules and how they interact with firms. And they do the same thing. And so I'm having these broader discussions. What's really interesting is that most regulators, when you explain why, and you say, we're thinking about it this way, they like it, because what you're actually doing is solving the problem. And even in countries like Japan, which is the last country on earth I would expect to have this approach, the head of the Financial Services Agency said to me, I love this, because actually I recognize that what we're doing isn't most effective, and the way firms are doing compliance isn't the most effective. So the fact that he was receptive to it shows you this can be done. Some regulators are a bit slower, but many of them are adopting it, and we're seeing lots of examples. So it's very important to remember that. But I think this is a much easier discussion to have than we just did what it said in the rules and we didn't think about it.
Thank you very much. I have another question, and when I was listening to you and you said we in compliance are in the business of influencing people, And it sounds a little bit controversial, but I think it's true. I mean, we want people to change the behavior to do the right thing. But isn't there an ethical limit? Should there be an ethical limit? How far can we go in this influencing? Because, you know, doing the right thing may change from time to time, from culture to culture. So what do you think about it?
So I always combine compliance and ethics. One, because compliance has there are lots of compliance rules that are ethical in nature. But it's also, I think, important when we think about influencing people to say, as an employer, what rights do we have? And I don't mean legal rights, I mean moral rights as well. And so this is a really important part of the equation where I use a very simple principle of just because you can doesn't mean you should. And we need to think carefully about how we balance personal rights of employees, for example, to use social media, and the risk profile and challenges of the firm. And so this is an absolutely key bit that I look at. And one of the frameworks that I teach people is about thinking about exactly this issue. If you start to think about this as a behavioral challenge, what you'll do is you'll start to say, okay, how will my employees feel if I get them, if I force them, if I ask them, if I persuade them to do this? And if you start thinking about it, it becomes easier to solve the problem, because the challenge you've got at the moment is nobody talks about this. We just assume that because you are employed, we can tell you what to do and you must comply with the rules. There are ethical dilemmas in what we do at the moment, and we don't often talk about those. What rights does an employer have to read your emails? There's a legal right. There's probably an ethical dimension that says, actually, we do need to know what is happening within our company. We're responsible for that. But equally, where does the personal begin? So this is not a new challenge. But I think behavioral science makes it a lot easier, because we can start to recognize if we have to do something that feels odd and feels weird to people, then we need to work with that. And if we recognize it, then we can design around that. And one of the things that we often don't do is think about, what will this feel like for the employee? We often don't care. You must do this training. And because you must do this training, I don't care whether you enjoy it. Now that's logical, but it doesn't get people's engagement. So I think this problem already exists. We need to open it much more. What behavioral science does is allows you to think about what those ethical dilemmas might be, because you're identifying what's going on in people's minds.
Thank you, Christian.
I have, Christian, I would like to ask you something about changes, about ethical changes in our real world, as you say, and real world today. We have difficult times in Argentina, in Latin America, and the entire world have health problems due to the COVID pandemic, economic problems, labor problems, people poverty, political discussions in Latin America especially. All this affects companies, affect families, affect countries, the entire society. And it seems to me inevitable that there will be major changes in the future. Organizations, companies, and in politics too, affecting corporate governance and affecting leadership especially. But perhaps we don't have a necessary commitment from the citizens, businessmen, and political leaders, especially related with leadership. So the questions will be, do we have now the necessary tone from the top, as we say in compliance, for an ethical change? And the second question will be, how can behavioral compliance be applied to manage these changes? You say something about this, but another detail. Thank you. And it was fantastic, your presentation.
Thank you. This is a really good question. And I think one of the things that's fascinating about COVID is we can start to see various compliance things being tried by different governments. So if you look at vaccines, there are some countries where they are bribing people, literally they're giving them cash to get vaccines. Other countries have used lotteries. In the UK, they are using lots of campaigns with people. We're engaging, it's voluntary, but there's a lot of social pressure to go. And what we've discovered looking and it's different in different countries, but what we've discovered is that one of the most effective ways to get people to take a vaccine is to talk to them about what, that it's helping other people, that it's the right thing to do. And not to force people and not to bribe them and not to try and educate them, but it's just actually to use a very strong ethical message. And what I think is interesting is this works internally within organizations. And one of the things that companies do quite a lot by mistake is that they say, you need to do this because it says so in the rules, right? We have a regulation we have to comply with and you need to do this. And that's correct. But here's what that does. The message that sends to people when you use that language is the only reason we are doing this thing is because of that stupid rule. Otherwise, we would not be doing it. And the tone from the top thing about compliance is really important because you can have the most amazing training, the most amazing program. But if one senior person says something silly like, oh, have you done that boring compliance training? Or please do this training, we have to do this. That can cause you major problems. What we need is people to say things like, yes, there are some rules here, but we think this is important for us. We do this because this is who we are about. And so there are lots of examples of compliance programs that could be more effective if the message wasn't, we do this to comply with the law, but we do this because we think it's right. And there are lots of examples of things where that is the case. Now, if you are just complying with a rule that you think is stupid, that you would never do in a million years, then transmitting a message that the only reason you're doing it is to keep the government happy is fine, because you don't think it's important from a risk management perspective. But if there are things that you think are important, ethics would be a good example, then communicating that to people from you, so it doesn't sound like it's coming from the regulator. The rules are irrelevant, if you like. We're doing this because this matters. This is the sort of company we are. That is much more powerful, and we don't use that anywhere near enough. We assume that a logic of the rules say this is powerful. We know as small children that when somebody says, do this because I said so, that they have no other argument. That is the worst argument from an emotional perspective ever, because it's just using authority. So this is a really important point. If we can get senior people engaged and to communicate that the reason we do this particular thing is because that's what we're about, that's our culture, that is the most powerful thing you can get. It beats bribery, it beats punishment, it beats all kinds of other things because it plays with people's emotions. So if you get that right, it can be really powerful.
Okay, Christian, we have one question from Juan Rosail, who is always in our meetings, and I know him. I know he works in behavioral, and he says that many companies in the region, including government agencies, have been heavily involved in corruption cases, and their reputations have been affected. The question of Juan is, what would be the first 3 steps that we should keep in mind from the point of view of behavioral compliance to start transforming these organizations and its people mentality for good?
Okay, so if you have an organization that is doing bad things, we go back to that logic that I talked about before and saying, let's not, we tend to focus on the people and we say, here's some bad people, but there will be something in the environment, the incentives, the message, the culture, the way people operate that will drive that behavior. So the first thing you have to recognize, what is driving culture within those institutions? And that might be the people at the top of the organization. It might be the mandate that they have been set. There'll be something around that. So I would start to look at this as an environmental problem. And sure, you need to identify if there's a bad person in there, you need to get rid of them. And maybe there's a lot of bad people, but you have to look at the environment, because if you don't change the environment, it's a little bit like trying to plant flowers in toxic soil. You can try planting more and more flowers, but they will all go bad. So we need to change the soil. So lots of times when you have a problem with these organizations, we think about changing people. We also need to look at the environmental factors. So what's the mandate of the organization? How are people remunerated? What is the perception of the people there? What kind of people are, how are they hiring people? What message are they giving them when they arrive? And look at those particular, and those dynamics are much more important. Things like transparency are also critical, right? We know that if we are being watched, we behave differently to us not being watched. And so if you have a government body that is seen to be acting in a corrupt manner, transparency is very, very powerful. So the quick answer is, yes, it's people doing bad things, but we need to understand the drivers. So my tip is Start to understand why the people in those organizations are behaving the way they are, and change the drivers of that behavior. And then people's behavior will change. You might have to get rid of some people, but if you just get rid of people, you're not going to solve the problem, because if the environment doesn't change, people's behavior doesn't change.
Right.
Thank you. We have some questions. We know it's 10 right now, so we apologize if everybody has to leave. We will have the tape recorded and it will be uploaded on the YouTube channel within a few days. But if you can stay, Kristen, just a little bit.
With pleasure. And look, if there are other questions people don't have time to ask or think of later, just get in touch with me.
Okay, we actually have, I think we can cover them. So let's just see what
Let's try.
So Enrique Prini, hi, thank you for joining us. Enrique says, when do you realize that a problem is with the rule? How much non-compliance is the matter?
I love that question, because that question is basically saying, give me a simple answer, give me a code. And what he's beautifully identified there is a compliance challenge. And the compliance challenge is, we say, what is our limit of tolerance, right? So we look at speed limits as a good example. You say, right, the limit, say the limit is 30. 30 might not be dangerous if you're Lewis Hamilton, a Formula One driver. Maybe that limit is far too low. And maybe if you're a crazy teenager, that limit is too high. But we have to create a sort of average when we create rules like that in compliance. And that's never exactly right for the exact people. So I would say you don't want to start with a thing that says, do you know what, 10% non-compliance is okay, but 20 is terrible. But you just want to have a feel for it. And I always look and say, look, is this a unique rule where lots of people are breaking it? And typically, the things that we care about are things that stand out. So when you think about meetings where you say, where do we have a compliance issue? It'll be those things that are causing you the biggest problem. Maybe the things that the regulator cares most about, maybe the things that are newly introduced, or just stuff where there's an issue. And I would say, decide on a case-by-case basis. And what's interesting about the question is you've started to frame compliance as a risk function. Because we often talk about compliance, say, well, we're here to ensure compliance. People often think that means 100% compliance. But actually, there is no company on this planet that is 100% compliant. Every firm breaks rules, and every single employee in every single company on the planet has broken a rule at some point. And I used to say, and people didn't like this, every single employee breaks at least one rule every single day. And there will be people that don't, but most people do, because you can't know all of the rules, and some of the rules are stupid and some of them are old. So what we need to start to do is to recognize which things do we really care about, and we take a risk-based approach. Now, you don't want to get compliance with all of your rules to 100%, and I'll tell you why. Some of them you do, right? So anything involving sanctions, fraud, crime, bullying, racism, all of those things, let's get those to zero. But for other things, particularly where it's recoverable, one of the things to think about is, if you don't have anybody ever breaking your rules, how do you know you've got them right? So we need to have a little bit of non-compliance to know that we've got the line right, because otherwise, maybe we've set it too tightly. Maybe in the example of the speed limit, if the speed limit is 200 and nobody ever breaks the speed limit, maybe we can bring it down to 150. We don't know. If we've got lots of people breaking the rule, maybe we need to change the speed limit, make it higher, because it's actually not dangerous. And so we need that little bit of human feedback around it. So I would say case-by-case basis, have a look at outliers. So if there's one rule that's similar to other rules and you've got lots of people, maybe you want to bring that back in line. But I would use a unique set of circumstances for each one, recognizing there are some policies and procedures that I don't want people breaching ever. And that is a different level of tolerance to something where I'd prefer it not to happen, but I can cope if it does.
Here we have another question from Vanina Lombardi. She says, do we always have to assume people won't understand the bad effect of the election cigarettes example, only we can convince them by making them play?
So this is the important thing here is you need to understand what your population is thinking. And one of the challenges, we often don't do that. We struggle with that. So here's a good example. If you are responsible for a process that happens once a year, so maybe it's the appraisal process from HR, or maybe it's a once a year attestation or a return or something that you need people to do very irregularly. You will have people in the organization whose job is to do that process. Now, if you are spending your whole time doing something, it's very difficult for you to understand what people who've never done this before feel and think. And you will think things are obvious that are not obvious to them. And so the first important thing here is to recognize, what does your audience understand? Not what would you like them to understand, but what do they understand? How will they perceive this? Will they view this positively or negatively? Is this something that they will immediately understand and get what's going on? Or is this confusing? Does this feel excessive or ridiculous? And so there's one of these frameworks that I teach people is to think about, as we go through a rule, as we're implementing it or reviewing it, we say to ourselves, what's the audience's perspective? What will employees think? And then we can calibrate accordingly. And there are some things where you don't need to explain to people why the rule is there, right? It's obvious, right? We all understand why there is a law against murdering people. I don't need to go through anything to explain that. But other things might not be obvious at all. And it may be that they don't understand the risk, they don't understand the rules. And remember, if you're in the business, you're not a compliance expert. If you wanted to be a compliance expert, you'd work in compliance. You want to be a salesperson or work in customer services. So it depends on their level of understanding. And that's the bit we have to work out. When we've worked out what their understanding is, what their exposure to this is, how frequently they see it, how will they feel about this, then we can start to target it. The mistake is to start by making a presumption. You need to go find out what is going on, sometimes by asking them, but also by observing them and saying, what can I learn from these people about the structure? And then I respond accordingly. If you design your response or you design your intervention before you know that, then you risk it not working. It's a little bit like me designing something that I know works in London, and I use a UK celebrity, and then I try and launch that in Argentina, where one, people might not speak English, and two, they don't know who the celebrity is. So even if it works in London, it might not work there. So we've got to understand our audience, and we've got to use the same tricks that marketing uses. So think about this as a marketing exercise, understand your audience, and then respond accordingly, and that will make it much more effective.
Great, Christian. I have one more question, and this is the last one we are going to make because of time issues, because there's a lot of questions, and I think all of them are very interesting because the subject, the topic is very interesting, and the way you present it is different from the traditional one. In this case, somebody from the audience says, most senior leaders, attorneys, and regulators like a more traditional approach, where if you have a cultural issue, then the answer is to implement policy and control.
Yep.
What's your advice for compliance officer to deal with that approach and effectively influence those stakeholders? So
this is really interesting because we all know that these things don't work, right? And we've seen this, and we see this time and time again, where companies, they just assume the solution is more training, right? If people have not been listening, we give them more training and we put more controls. Now, I can explain it in behavioral terms and point out why it's silly, but that can be very difficult for people in an organization to do, and there's lots of politics here. So one of the reasons I like talking about the real world is to find examples of things elsewhere and to highlight that actually, if you did this thing in another context, people would think you were mad. So we wouldn't do this to customers. Why do we assume that if a customer's not behaving the way we want, we don't automatically assume the customer's an idiot and needs to be shouted at. We might, but we're probably not going to keep the customer for very long. So I try and find examples that are elsewhere to illustrate the psychological impact of what's happening. And you have to use behavioral science in having this discussion. So if you go to your boss or the business and you say, you are an idiot and this is stupid, right? You are not going to win anybody over. So you have to find a nice way to explain to them that there may be an alternative. And one of the things that when I started on this journey, one of the things I would do is I would not wait until something had gone wrong and then try and implement it. Because when something has gone wrong, there is politics, there is embarrassment, there is emergency, there is a crisis sense. And in crises, people sometimes make bad decisions. So try and do this when there isn't an emergency, when there's a new thing coming where you haven't got a problem to solve, to demonstrate that this way of thinking is more effective. If you are in the middle of a crisis, then try and think and have, as you walk around, look for things that will give you a clue and see how does the government do this? And you can use somebody else's stupidity as a way of bringing the subject up. So rather than saying, you are an idiot and this is terrible, is point out and say, well, that's interesting. Look at what the government did here. That wasn't very effective. Or this, hey, look at this business. They did something really stupid. And then you don't have to discuss it directly with them. But it's tough and it's challenging. And that's why, this takes time to develop. You have to start understanding it and getting there. And, that's why I work with people to support them, to get them through this process, to give you enough knowledge so that you can go in there with examples, because stories are really powerful. If you just turn around to someone and say, you're an idiot, you're wrong, people will look at you, that's not nice. If you say, here is some evidence, here's some reasons, here's an example of why, and that's why I talk about software and car rental and classrooms. None of you are working in the exact situation where that's relevant, but you know what I'm talking about. And that's the way we have to communicate. Find things that are not threatening to make the point. But this is not easy, and I recognize entirely that it's easy for me to say. And the other thing, and this is totally to my benefit, it's easier for someone external to say it than someone internal. So one of the things I do for some of my clients is I fulfill that function. I become the bad guy who comes in to point this stuff out, and then there's no politics associated. So that's another solution. But don't confront people, because if you do that, you are trying to argue something, and if they think it's the right solution, you're gonna waste a lot of time. So you have to find clever ways to persuade them.
Thank you very much. This is very, very interesting, the way you teach us today to start talking, to start analyzing this topic from a different point of view, and to understand people. And we agree, and Mariana and Diego, we work a lot in behavioral because we understand that people is the clue, is the of compliance nowadays. So, well, we want to thank you another time, because once more time, sorry, because this was really very interesting for us, and I want to share with them perhaps in the future we can contact you again for another meeting if you want. It will be very important to us to have your point of view, your experience, and all the examples you give us. There's a lot of questions and appearing more questions, but unfortunately we are on time. So Mariana and Diego, do you want to say something to close? Because we are out of the slot time.
Only to say thank you very much. And
I agree with Diego and Susan. I think it was a wonderful presentation, Kristen, and it's a very interesting topic. And we know you're working on this. We are working on our side too. So we hope we can develop more of these sessions together. Thank you very, very much for your time, and thank you to everybody. Gracias a todos y todas por sumarse y compartir con nosotros este tiempo hoy.
Thank you so much.
Una última cosa, vamos a, como dijo Mariana al principio, pero por las dudas, si había gente que no estaba conectada, vamos a desgrabar toda la reunión y hacer una traducción en paralelo que quedará en inglés y en castellano para que todos podamos tener acceso a todo lo que se discutió hoy. Así que muchísimas gracias a todos los que participaron, en las autoridades de la Asociación Argentina de Ética y Compliance. Muchas gracias a todos. Cristian, again, thank you, thank you, thank you.
Thank you for listening. It's been a pleasure.
Bye.